Hi. Okay, so this is Pathwork Lecture number 14. The higher self, the lower self, and the mask. Greetings in the name of the Lord. Blessed is this hour in which I am permitted to speak to you, my friends. I have promised to talk to you tonight about how we in the spirit world see the entire human personality, the complete unit of human personality. You all know that man does not have only a physical body, but also various so-called subtle bodies. Each subtle body represents something different. You all know that man's thoughts have definite spiritual forms, but not only thoughts create such forms, but also feelings. For a feeling is really nothing else but unthought thought, thought that is not made conscious. And although thought creates a different type of form than feeling does, nevertheless both create such definite and for us very substantial forms. Each subtle body, as well as the physical body, has a so-called aura. These thought forms or feeling forms give their image in the aura, but these images are merely the reflection of their reality. These forms exist truly, but around or outside the personality, and their images are just reflected in the personal auras. These forms create the spheres in the spirit world, and according to the intensity of the thoughts or feelings, they are vague and weak or definite, strong, and durable. In other words, all these forms are more or less fluctuating, changing, and thus you will understand better that everything is in perpetual motion in spirit. The aura of the physical body shows physical sickness or health or any and all of the states of physical being, while emotional, intellectual, or spiritual reactions show in the aura of the receptive subtle body. I'm going to read that again. The aura of the physical body shows physical sickness or health or any and all states of the physical being, while emotional, intellectual, or spiritual reactions show in the aura of the receptive subtle body. Each living being has his higher self or the divine spark. This is the finest, most radiant of the subtle bodies with the quickest frequency of vibration. I'll read it again. Each living being has his higher self or the divine spark. This is the finest, the most radiant of the subtle bodies with the quickest frequency of vibration. You see, the aura is the vibration and the emanation of the respective subtle bodies, and the higher the spiritual development, the quicker is the vibration or frequency. Since the fall of the angels, the higher self surrounded itself in a slow process and in gradual stages with various layers of denser matter, not yet the physical body. But from your point of view, these layers are also of subtle matter because you cannot see them with your physical eye, but they are infinitely denser than the higher self. Thus, the lower self came into existence. The aim of the spiritual development is to eliminate the lower self so that the higher self becomes free again of all layers it has acquired. In your practical life, you will be able to sense quite easily with yourself or others that certain parts of the higher self are already free, while other parts of it are still hidden. So how much is free and how much is hidden? How thickly is it sometimes hidden depends on the overall development of the respective person. The lower self does not only consist of the common faults, the individual weaknesses that vary with each person, but also of ignorance and laziness. And it hates to change and to conquer itself. It has a very strong will that may not always manifest outside, and wants its way without paying the price. It is very proud and selfish. It has always a great deal of personal vanity, the ego with all its manifestations. And all these characteristics are generally part of the lower self, regardless of other individual faults. But there are many shades, many possibilities in which the lower self can display these general trends contained in it. This depends on various other factors, for instance, on the personal faults, which can take different effect on these common traits of the lower self, but also on the good qualities, as well as on various other circumstances, all of which together influence the outer manifestation, intensity, degree, and direction these general trends may take. We see the higher self and we see the lower self, but this applies, of course, only to spirits who have attained a certain degree of development. Not all spirits can see all the subtle bodies of a creature. In other words, the mere fact that a spirit leaves his physical body does not the mere fact that a spirit leaves his physical body behind does not in the least imply that he can necessarily see more than any of you can see. But a spirit who has attained a certain degree of development will not only be able to interpret the lower self, but he will be able to see through it to the higher self in all its splendor, because dense matter, whether it is physical or dense matter in the beyond, does not represent an obstacle for our eyes and or perception. So we can determine very well what thought forms come from the higher self and which thought forms come from the lower self, and which tendencies, wishes, desires, and endeavors from the higher self may be mixed in with the other tendencies from the lower self, so that their original shade is twisted, colored, and dirtied. And when the messages from the higher self are tainted with the motives of the lower self, a disorder is created in the soul, which makes its bearer emotionally ill. All these various tendencies have different colors and, my friends, different tones and scents. For example, a person may want something selfish because he does not want to admit to himself this selfishness. He begins to rationalize this selfish desire and to fool himself about it. We can see all this very clearly, and indeed similar self-deception is extremely frequent among human beings. The forms of the higher self have an entirely different character than the ones of the lower self. That leads me to the mention of another layer that is unfortunately not yet recognized even among human beings in full significance. It is what I might term the mask self, and this mask self is created in the following way. When a person recognizes that he may get in conflict with his surroundings by giving in to his lower self, he may nevertheless not be ready to take the consequences by paying the price in eliminating the lower self, which means, first of all, to face the lower self as it really is, with all its motives and drives. For you can only conquer something of which you are fully aware. So this means taking the narrow path, the spiritual path. Many people do not want to think that far. Many people do not want to think that far. They react emotionally without even thinking about it. And the so-called subconscious feels it is necessary to present a different picture of the self in order to avoid certain difficulties, unpleasantness, or disadvantages of all sorts. Thus, they create this other layer of self that has nothing to do with reality, neither with the reality of the higher self, nor with the temporary reality of the lower self. It is what you guys call phony, or it is a false mask, unreal. It is false, it is unreal. And I will return to the above example. The lower self dictates to the person, the lower self dictates to the person to be quite ruthless about a selfish desire. It is not difficult for even the most limited intelligence to realize that by giving in to this desire, the result will be to be ostracized, to be disliked by other people. No one wants that. Instead of overcoming the selfishness by the slow process of development, such a person often acts as though he were unselfish, but actually he is selfish. He feels the selfishness. He hates to be forced to act against the wishes of his lower self, and he feels a compulsion to a necessary outside act with which he is not at all at peace with in his still, at least in this respect, predominant lower nature. So his giving in, his generosity is only a pretense, not at all reconciled with his true feelings. In other words, the right act is entirely unsupported because of the unpurified feelings, and therefore the person is at war with himself. The proper act becomes an act of necessary compulsion instead of a freely chosen one. And this is not paying the price in the real sense. For a person may give something, he may hate the idea. Thus he is not only actually just as selfish within by his inner conviction, but besides he is untrue to his nature. He is violating his reality. He is living a lie. From this does by no means follow that it is advisable to give in to one's lower nature, but rather the enlightenment has to be fought for, the development striven for, to purify the feelings and desire. If this is not accomplished, at least there should be no self-deception. The person should at least have a clear and true picture about the discrepancies of his feelings and actions. And in this way, no mask self can form. However, it is too often the case that a person tries to believe in his own unselfishness. He's fooling himself about his real feelings and the motives of not showing them. And after a while, the evil root will sink into the subconscious, where it will ferment and it will create its forms that have their effect, and it cannot be eliminated when one is unaware of it consciously. The example of selfishness is merely one instance. There are many other traits and trends that go through the same process, my friends. And when people are emotionally sick, it is always in one way or another that a mask self has been created. I'm going to read that again. When people are emotionally sick, it is always in one way or another that a mask self has been created. They do not realize that they are living a lie. They have built this layer of unreality that has nothing to do with their real being. Thus, they are not true to their real personality. And as I said before, being true to oneself does not mean that you should give in to your lower self, but be aware of it. Be aware of it. Do not fool yourself if you are still acting to necessity, not out of enlightened vision and inner conviction. Be aware that your feelings are still unpurified in this or that respect. And then you have a good basis from which to start. It will be easier for you to face yourself in this manner when you realize that underneath the layers of your lower self lives your higher self, your ultimate absolute reality, which you must eventually reach. And in order to reach it, you must face first your lower self, your temporary reality, instead of covering it up, because that puts an even greater distance between you and absolute reality, or your own higher self. And in order to face the lower self, you must at all costs tear down the mask self. And you can bring yourself to do so when you visualize these three selves that I am discussing here. To lie to oneself, it is often sufficient not to think about one's emotions and true motives at all, but merely to let the emotions react without thinking. He who wants to be happy, healthy, and at peace with oneself, he who wants to fulfill his life truly, he who wants to be in harmony with God and thus with oneself, has to realize once and for all what is the actual me or you. What is my higher self? What is my lower self? And where may there be a mask or falsehood? And with many, many people, there is a mask, at least in some respect. And this mask represents to us a very ugly color, my dear friends. It is not dark or black or sinister as the trends of the lower self are in their variation. But the colors of the mask self are sickly sweetish. Sweet as in sweet, tasting sweet-ish. They're sickly sweet-ish. If you are an artist or artistically inclined, it is easy for you to determine a good, genuine color or an unreal, sweetly artificial color. You even have created a word for bad art and bad coloring. You call it trash. It is the same with the tones of the mask self, as well as the odor, which is also sickly nauseating. We even prefer the emanation and effects of the lower self, unpleasant as it may be for us, but at least it is honest. It is important for all of you to try to train your inner eye to see yourselves and other human beings from that point of view. The more you become spiritually awake, the easier it will be for you to perceive yourselves and others from that point of view. You will feel when you come into contact with the higher self a very distinct difference with the mask self once your intuition has awakened, also in this respect through your personal spiritual development. You will nauseatingly feel the manifestation of the mask self, first of all, your own, of course, pleasantly as it may present itself. If your human psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists would begin to view their patients from this point of view, they would accomplish a lot more. They would access where they are still unsuccessful. I didn't know I had that, and I'm so happy. And the time will come when this knowledge will be theirs, when they are mature and courageous enough to include spiritual reality in their thinking, and they will discover that psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists, they will discover all this and prove the truth of their success with their patients. They will solve problems with their patients even though they cannot see as we can, that were impossible to solve so far. The mere knowledge of these three parts of human personality will make a tremendous difference in the results they will obtain because they will, after some practice and studying, determine comparatively easy what part of the self they are dealing in certain phases. They will develop different means to deal with the different selves, and they will be able to instruct the conscious and will directing part of the person about these facts, and that will make a great deal of difference. If a person is ready to accept help in this respect, the conscious, and the will direction of the part of the self is on the proper road. Let me read that again because I kind of bushed it. If a person is ready to accept help in that respect, the conscious and will direction part of the self is on the proper road. But it remains to accomplish that the subconscious layers of the personality become penetrated with these truths as well, which can only be done by the person himself, so that all inner resistances will be overcome. Let me read that again because that's really important. If a person is ready to accept help in that respect, the conscious and will direction part of the self is on the proper road. But it remains to accomplish that the subconscious layers of the personality become penetrated with these truths as well, which can only be done by the person himself, so that all inner resistances will be overcome. If you want to walk this path, if you want to be cured of your emotional sicknesses, it will be important for you to understand all of this. Even if you are not what is called a neurotic, even in your case, there are only even if in your case there are only minor deviations from the law within you, it will be very useful for you to understand all this and to meditate upon it and to meditate about it. This may be an explanation for you why it happens quite frequently that when a person is psychoanalyzed by a doctor who is not only very rigidly follows a school of thought that does not permit any spiritual truth and facts, but who is besides not very intuitive about such things, although there may be also doctors who have a good intuition and who have a very strong and good guidance, and with these the following may not happen quite so often and so strongly. This person may go through such a crisis that the state of mind becomes worse than the treatment was started. Let me read that again. Let me read that whole thing again because this is really intense. If you want to walk this path, if you want to be cured of your emotional sicknesses, it will be important for you to understand all of this, even if you are not what is called a neurotic, even if in your case there are only minor deviations from the law within you. It will be very useful for you to understand all this and to meditate about it. This may be an explanation for you why it happens quite frequently that when a person is psychoanalyzed by a doctor who not only very rigidly follows a school of thought that does not admit any personal truth and facts, but who is besides not very intuitive about such things, although there may be also doctors who have a very good intuition and who have a very strong and good guidance with these, the following may not quite happen quite so often and so strongly. But this person may go through such a crisis that this state of mind becomes worse than before the treatment was started. This happens when the doctor has succeeded to tear down this mask self, and the patient is in front of his lower self. The patient may be so shattered by this experience that he breaks down completely. He may give up the help, and it may even have more serious consequences. On the other hand, if this person would be told what I am telling you here, and thus be prepared for what to expect, so much hardship and often even tragedy could be avoided. If a patient knew that he has to face the lower self that exists in each human being, but that this lower self, unpleasant as it may be, is not the ultimate I or true self, but that the higher self, which is perfection, is waiting to grow out of these layers of imperfection, that this shock would never occur. And therefore, this knowledge is important for your psychologists and doctors of all kinds, as well as for all teachers, parents, etc. It would be a great deal. It would help a great deal. And perhaps you have a question in connection with this subject, my dear friends. So I'm going to read some of the questions. Question: what is the metaphysical explanation of allergies? People are, for instance, often even allergic to things they love. Answer: there may be different explanations for this. Generally speaking, I might say, for instance, it may be just the fact that the true personality is not allowed to evolve, and that a mask is put over it, and the inner reaction also, the revolt of the, let me read it again. There may be different explanations for this. Generally speaking, I might say, for instance, it may be just the fact that the true personality is not allowed to evolve, that a mask is put over it, and the inner reaction, also the revolt by the higher self, may create certain physical symptoms in order to wake up the person and to find out the reason. This is only one explanation, and there may be others. For instance, another possibility is that very often the human soul is torn apart by conflicting desires. One part of the personality wants to go in one direction, another part wants to go in the opposite direction, and these pull alternately. The soul has not made peace with oneself, has not put order into it by leaving all these trends more or less in the subconscious, and this creates a great strain and friction. As long as these currents are not brought out into consciousness so as to be dealt with, to be examined, and to understand their true meaning and motive, this inner fight cannot be settled. On the other hand, the lower self works against bringing out anything into the open as long as the conscious and will directing part of the personality does not take matters into its own hands. This inner fight and friction goes on due to the fact that all this takes place in the subconscious. All that comes out are the symptoms, which may be tiredness, allergies, and various other physical symptoms. These conflicting tendencies actually create a short circuit in the soul. A third alternative is that there may be a shock reaction in the life of a person. Now, this person has to put the incidents into the subconscious. He does not remember it consciously at all, but by chance a food or a plant or an animal or some such thing may have been in connection with this shock, not directly. But it may have played a role, even in an important indirect one, but the person has this association and reacts accordingly. So this incidence may have occurred in childhood, even in infancy, or even in a previous incarnation. It is not always necessary to remember the actual incident, although this can help too. But the main point is that the wrong inner reaction that has created this evil root is cleared away. And whenever anything is put away into the subconscious, you can be quite sure that there must be some sort of inner wrong reaction. Any of these alternatives, broadly speaking, and the variations, also 2 or 3 of them together interacting, may be responsible for allergies. But there may also be other possibilities, but it is quite impossible for me to go into all the details now. I'm just giving you a general outline. Question: there is a lot of hypocrisy in this world, which of course is the mask self. It is encouraged by the world because the world wants to see good. From the point of view of the whole of mankind, isn't it preferable to do and act right, even if it is a mask, rather than to remain one's lower self if somebody cannot really eradicate it? Answer: everybody can eradicate if one really wants to. It is only a question of how much of it you can eradicate in this present incarnation. But enough can be eradicated that you will not commit crimes, that you will not do harmful things to others. Besides, the issue does not present the alternative between giving in to the lower self or creating a mask self. As I have explained it, Even if the feelings cannot be purified at once, and this takes indeed quite a long time, effort, and patience, the point is that one is aware of one's own imperfections. You're aware of one's unclean desires and lower nature while acting in accordance with the standards of your society, instead of believing the masked self is one's true nature and the real self, and thus fooling oneself, creating an inner lie. In other words, you do not choose between becoming a cannibal, if this is your lower self, and following the dictations of it, or being hypocritical and fooling yourself. No. You should be aware that you are acting according to necessity and for your own convenience, while your feelings are still unpurified and not always in accordance with your outer actions, provided you cannot or will not do the necessary work in order to purify yourself. Even if you are taking the road of purification, until you can expect some measure of excess, you will have to wait and work and work and wait. And in the meantime, this self-honesty is an absolute essential and necessary requisite for any success in this most wonderful venture. But even if you are unwilling to take this road, it is infinitely better to have no self-illusions than to create this unhealthy and sickly aura. Do you understand that now? Question: Does the spirit world see human beings in our forms as we see each other, plus thought forms, plus colors, and all together? No. If it is a spirit who is still very much earthbound, he will see your bodies in very much the same way as you see yourselves. But he will not see what a spirit of higher development can see. On the other hand, spirits of higher development do not always see your bodies